Hello, everyone. Toward Inclusive Excellence is excited to welcome back Dr. Martha S. Jones, Society of Black Alumni Presidential Professor, Professor of History, and Professor at the SNF Agora Institute at Johns Hopkins University. I'm Alexia Hudson-Ward, Editor-in-Chief of Toward Inclusive Excellence, and in this episode, we speak with Martha about her latest project, Hard Histories at Hopkins. This project examines the role that racism and discrimination have played at Johns Hopkins and within the city of Baltimore. The project's solution-centered approach aims to develop new understanding and relationships on how to heal and move forward from a complicated past. Martha is the author of several outstanding books, including Vanguard: How Black Women Broke Barriers, Won the Vote, and Insisted on Equality for All, which received the 2021 Los Angeles Times Book Award for History. Vanguard was also unfortunately subjected to being banned by a public library board in Louisiana. In our discussion, Martha reflects on this part of her personal hard history and how it informs her current work and scholarship. Now on to our discussion with Dr. Martha S. Jones. Martha, thank you so much for joining us again. It's so exciting to have you here for what I know is going to be yet another great conversation.
Well, I'm really honored to be back. So thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So Martha, since our last interview, you've been working on further developing what I think is such a fascinating project, Hard Histories at Hopkins, Johns Hopkins University. And this project examines the role that racism and discrimination has played at the university since the university's inception. So would you provide our audience an overview of Hard Histories at Hopkins' objectives?
Sure. First of all, thanks for following our work. We really appreciate that. And as we'll get to talk about, one of the things that we've tried to work hard at is being accessible beyond the small circle of researchers who work with us. So it's really an honor for us to be here. Some folks may know that our project began when Johns Hopkins University in medicine learned that our founder and namesake, Mr. Johns Hopkins, had not been the Quaker abolitionist that the university had long held him out to have been. Instead, we learned that Mr. Hopkins in 1840 and 1850, even before the founding of the university and hospital, Mr. Hopkins had held enslaved people in his household. Mm-hmm. And this revelation, required research expertise that would let us, as best we could, develop a fuller understanding of those snippets of his story, new snippets that came from the U.S. Census. But it also required a kind of introspection and a self-examination on the part of the university. And so alongside important work on the part of the university administration, I created the Hard Histories at Hopkins lab that would, look at this sort of originary story, if you will, but would look more broadly, as you said, at the history of slavery, discrimination, and racism at Johns Hopkins. It really connects with important work that was already ongoing, and that was the consortium that is called Universities Studying Slavery. I think we were number 74 or 75 among the universities and colleges that have joined that initiative. Part of what was a bit distinct about us is that we were founded after the Civil War. And so I think, like many institutions, we thought we might have, if you will, escaped or avoided, or we weren't really part of this circle. But of course, it turns out that we are. So there we are, joining a bigger effort and a kind of reckoning of with colleges and universities across the country to think about the connections of our founding to slavery. At the same time, our initiative was from the beginning committed to being led by student researchers, that we understood that in some ways, in many ways, students are the future of the institution. Not only are they sort of the heartbeat of the institution, they are the inheritors. They become, the alum, they become the benefactors, they become the trustees. And so it felt like we could make an investment in students that would serve us institutionally well over a very long time. And so our work has happened always in student organized labs. And then we wanted to very quickly think deliberately about how the work we were doing was not only a Johns Hopkins initiative. Now, some of your followers may know, Johns Hopkins it's a big footprint in Baltimore and Maryland. If I'm not mistaken, we're the largest private employer in the state, for example.
Okay.
And yet we knew early on that the kinds of questions we were asking about our institution, other institutions in Baltimore were also asking about themselves. Museums, other cultural institutions, educational institutions, historic sites, many of which were founded in the middle of the 19th century, had told their stories much as we did in a sanitized way, were also beginning to do research and engage in this self-examination. And so the last of our goals really was to place ourselves in that broader constellation and open ourselves up to a different kind of accountability that comes with being one in a local consortium rather than the only one as we might have been.
Wow, what an incredible assemblage of activities, and really what is compelling to think about are these student-led labs. So could you talk a little more about how those labs are constructed, managed? Of course, students graduate, and so how do you transition with the new group coming in and the group that will be moving towards commencement? Really interested in hearing a little more about that.
Yeah, any educator knows, you've only got so many weeks, and and for historians, 12, 13, 14 weeks can seem like a nanosecond, given that I have written books that have taken more than a decade, and I don't think I'm unusual in that regard. So this is one of the questions we confronted early on: is how do we incorporate students who are with us for 14 weeks? At the same time, how do we respond to a community, both on campus and off, that wants answers, and they don't want to wait 10 years until I've done the sort of historian's job that I did. So we really changed the model by breaking the research into small, doable bits over the course of a semester, putting students into teams so that they could partner on a question, partner on an archive, and do a deep dive collaboratively. We have benefited extraordinarily from archivists and librarians who partner with us, roll up their sleeves, and make sure that students not only have a deep orientation to the archive, but have, again, that professional expert companionship in the archive. I'll say we started, as many projects have in recent years, during COVID. And for example, the Maryland State Archives digitized things and made them available to us remotely. so that student researchers could, in the course of a semester, produce work. And so in a way, it turned out to be a great gift to us because we already had pressure from our constituents and our followers to produce work in a timely way, to release findings in a timely way. And now with student researchers, we could do that. Last thing on this is graduate students have been the glue, if you will. Graduate students have stayed with us over the course of a year, over the course of semesters, over the course and the life of the project, so that they, in many ways, are the continuity from semester to semester as research assistants, as teaching assistants. I don't think we could have executed this model if we didn't have that kind of presence of graduate students.
Yeah, thank you so much. Martha, I want to ask a question about how we can help to reckon this notion of higher education institutions contributing to systemic racism. Because we know that there are some people that really have a difficult time with this concept, that higher education institutions are really in many aspects a part of these broader complications that we find ourselves in as a society. And so how does the Hard Histories at Hopkins project seek to really educate without alienating? Because I also know this is a really divisive topic.
Yeah. There's a lot to say on this.
I know.
Maybe I'll let me start with the last part and say that I loved your phrase, educate, but not alienate.
Yes.
And this it captures one of the challenges that we faced from the beginning. Again, your followers may or may not know, but Johns Hopkins has a long and deeply fraught relationship to the city of Baltimore, and in particular to Black Baltimoreans. And we did a research piece on this question one semester, really trying to discover the fabric of that with some of our student researchers. But for us, this meant, first of all, I think, troubling expertise and pulling back the curtain on how we do what we do. Frequently, as scholars, we present conclusions. They're tied up neatly. They're wrapped up in a package that often looks like a book or article. And we don't show folks the messy behind the scenes of how we get where we go. So we started with a webinar series where we invited wonderful historians. At the start, people like Dr. Jessica Millward and Dr. Will Thomas, who were longstanding historians of slavery in Baltimore and Maryland, to come and not only to talk about their findings, but to talk about the process, right? How do you do that work? Upcoming, we have Dr. David Carey and Rachel Swarns, who are going to talk about the connections between Georgetown's slaveholding and Loyola of Maryland's history. And again, inviting them, yes, to share their findings, but to show folks how we work, why it takes us so long, what it means for us to test hypotheses, all of these things that oftentimes don't make it into the pages of a book or article. It felt important to really lift the hood and show people what we do. And then we confronted this question about how to communicate what we do in a way that feels timely, that feels transparent, that creates dialogue about the work we're doing. And so we went on to sponsor a Substack, where during the semester, once a week, we write about what we're reading, what we're researching, how we're making connections to other sorts of work that is circulating. Creating a space where people can see how we think, how we learn, how we research in real time, and not ask folks to wait even till the end of a semester, but really to invite folks to tune in and week out and follow us.
Yes.
Lastly, we've done some important convenings, or I hope important convenings. One this past fall in Baltimore, where we came together with museums and historic sites, cultural institutions, and more to share notes and to better see ourselves as a community that is doing this important reckoning with Baltimore's difficult history. And this year, we haven't mentioned, I'm coming to you from Berlin in Germany, where I'm a fellow at the Wissenschaft College. And we are hosting convenings here in Berlin and also in Paris, working with scholars who have worked on the history of slavery, but of discrimination, of colonialism, and more, as a way of making those really important connections too. So I hope, that partly by, in a sense, stepping away from books and articles, academic books and articles, we begin to speak a language and speak in a style that is less alienating and more accessible, which is maybe another way of thinking about your question. I mean, you asked me, do you want me to talk about this sort of the, whose hard history this is and that kind of thing?
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
I think that for myself, I think this is a part of what I think this work has taught me, and in particular doing this work in Baltimore has taught me, is that there is a lane. It's not all of what we might be doing, and it's certainly not all that we do as historians around these subjects, but there is a lane for self-examination, for institutional accountability, an investment in an understanding and unearthing, a confrontation, and then a set of reflections and actions, right, in response to what we learn. So for me, hard history is hard in part because it is writing from the inside out. And this is not the only model, but it is a different model. And I think that as a result, we not only have a broad community of accountability, we have an ability to change the narrative, change the foundations, transform about how an institution like ours thinks about itself. One of the things that I learned in the midst of this work was something about my own family. And I learned that my grandmother's grandmother and her mother had all been owned in the 19th century by a college professor in Danville, Kentucky.
Wow.
And I share that to say that I am among those who I think have in moments been not only moved, but arrested by what we have discovered. And I count myself among the descendants of enslaved people who are part of the story about slavery in universities and more. And that is hard. I'm neither sophisticated enough or inured enough or cynical enough to assume that anyone who encounters this sort of history will not be touched by it in some way, though we would allow that some folks are not. For us, that has meant thinking very deliberately and working with experts around the position and the perspective and the role that descendants should and must play in the kind of work that we do. So I hope that our work collectively has been, yes, committed to the kind of rigors that we associate with historical research, but it has been as committed to the kinds of ethical questions that conducting this kind of work and conducting it, in the belly of the beast, so to speak, demands of us. And it would be not wholly forthcoming to say that that's always easy or that that's always straightforward. We are in a constant negotiation, institutionally and otherwise. We're in a constant rethinking of how do we get this right and true in a way that will be a model for work going forward rather than a throwback to something that we regret. And that is, this adds layers of complexity to the work. But one of the things about our students, right, is that they have really stepped right into that role, right? Eager to grapple not only with the important and exciting discovery of what one can know from the archives, but with a profound compassion for both folks from the past, but those of us in the present who are sort of the living legacies of this difficult history.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Wow, what a powerful answer. And a lot of your points really segue, Martha, into my next question around labeling this work as hard, right? So I think to the unknowing ear and eye, to think about histories that involve the layers of complexities with marginalized people, referring to it as hard is kind of like sometimes a difficult thing to reconcile. And so why refer to this incredible work and to this particular collection of histories as hard?
Yeah. For us, hard has a double meaning, which is to say, I still am of the view that, and I'm a student and a follower of historians of slavery, I think very few of whom would miss the opportunity to tell you the personal challenges and the psychic cost of an immersion in the archive of slavery, and the archive of its many legacies. So
yes.
I hope, right, that in part by inviting people into our research, inviting them to sit with us, to read with us, to deliberate with us, the term hard is intended to be an acknowledgement of the psychic demands that this history places on those of us, in particular, those of us who are descendants. And again, I wouldn't impose that or require that of anyone, but my experience tells me that even the most sophisticated and seasoned of historians, those who have spent their careers in the archives of slavery, will tell you that there are days and weeks and moments and scenes in which they must literally stand up from the table, leave the room, take time for their own well-being. This is still a part of our experience, even as we know so much more, in a way, right, than we ever have about this past. So there's this. But the other thing that hard is intended to signal is that if you're going to do this work from the inside out, you are going to be confronted with a great deal of discussion institutionally about what it might mean to compromise or put at risk the reputation or the shiny veneer of an institution. I'll tell you one small bit at Johns Hopkins, because we were doing this work in 2020 and into 2021, one of the discussions that we rightly had was about how releasing this new understanding, this new knowledge, this hard dimension of our past, how that might compromise us as public health workers who were preparing to roll out a COVID vaccine. And there were those who said, are we sure we want to do this? We already face so many impediments. We already have so many self-inflicted impediments around public trust. This will just further undermine our trust. And I had to sit with that, right? I think rightly. Yeah. At the same time, we have experienced pointed criticism, organized criticism, public criticism that has, I think, gone, for me, certainly far beyond any sort of criticism my prior work had ever done. More pointed, more unbounded, more personal. And so you will find in your institution people who are deeply invested in the stories that had long been told. Mr. Hopkins, the abolitionist Quaker, and folks, I know we're going to get to the current moment, but one aspect of the current moment, right, is that critics, the boundaries, if they haven't been wholly exploded, right, have really shifted so that we have been targeted by critics in ways that has made the work very difficult. So I wanted to signal with Hard Histories this double-edged meaning, and that there is something distinct about doing the work from inside. I'll say the last thing. I'm a tenured professor. It seems that still has a meaning in terms of insulating us from criticism. I work pursuant to academic freedom, but in some quarters, hard history work is being done by librarians.
Yes.
It's being done by archivists. It's being done by curators, people who don't enjoy the same privileged insulation that I do from criticism. That's hard, right? That's risky in real terms. And we want to acknowledge that that is a particular position to be in vis-a-vis this sort of work. And yet, in our community, there are many people doing this hard work day in and day out, not only absorbing the psychic challenges, but also the risks that presents them with in their standing, in their advancement, and their security in their jobs.
Right, absolutely. And, I know there's a lot of ongoing discourse, Martha, within the academy around kind of who should be under the cloak or the tent of protection of academic freedom, right?
Yes.
Yet so many of our colleagues, be they tenured or not, are really working diligently despite, the climate that we're all in right now, to forward this knowledge. I think, and I appreciate you honoring that and lifting that up.
Yeah. And I would say, I was very clear, Hard Histories is not a direct instrument of the university. It is my research initiative that unfolds under this umbrella of academic freedom. But my argument has been anybody in the university community who is tasked with research should enjoy the same protections, right? That I don't know. Once you're no longer tasked, I don't know where the line might be. Maybe cataloging, versus research in a library. Should there be a spectrum? But it has opened up, I think, at an important moment. It has reinforced our open commitment to academic freedom.
Yes, absolutely. We could spend hours just on that point. Oh my goodness. Indeed. And I do want us to shift to the current times, as you were saying, and again, interestingly, this notion, while it has some elements on the nexus of academic freedom, here we go again, with this energy, deeply politicized energy, right, around knowledge and knowledge banning, right? And so one of your books, Vanguard, was banned a few years ago. And we have since then seen this remarkably swift and deeply strategic uptick in book and knowledge banning in the United States. And so it really makes a project like Hard Histories at Hopkins so timely and so highly relevant. But what do you make of this deliberate attempt to sanitize American history? And what can we in the academy do about it? So if we don't necessarily have the resources or the capacity to advance, a multi-tiered project like a Hard History at Hopkins, what can we do in this moment to really cloak and envelope the importance of knowledge sharing, not knowledge sanitizing and banning?
Yeah. The first thing I'll say is thank you to the American Library Association, because when my book was challenged, I was at a loss for how to proceed, and discovered it was like a revelation that the American Library Association was there, that expert folks there understood exactly what was happening to me and to my book. They helped me to understand, and most importantly, they took action, right? And so it's so important to any chance I have to acknowledge that. And if folks don't know about this work, tune in, and you will, I think, be very moved by how folks are in very difficult times championing knowledge, books, all the things that so many of us stand for. I mentioned I'm in Berlin this semester, and one of the things that has most directly shocked colleagues about the many things that might shock them about being an academic in the U.S. at this moment is that that my work has been suppressed and banned in the United States.
Yes.
They find this stunning. So I mentioned that to say that to bring into relief, right, that there is something happening in the U.S. that is distinct and is serious and is shocking to people from many parts of the world, including people who come from parts of the world where authoritarian regimes have held sway for many years. This is shocking. What should we do?
Yes.
What should we do? I think the first thing I want to say is we must not be cynical. We must not be cynical. I think it is too easy to say it's always been like this, or of course it's like this. I really think we must hold ourselves accountable to being present and to lift up one another and our capacities to be present for the challenges that we face. I then think some of us need to become new kinds of educators. I'm someone who imagined I would spend my career teaching in college and university classrooms and seminars and lecture halls. But today I work, openly and notoriously and excitedly, but importantly, with, the Zinn Education Project or the Gilder Lehrman Institute, the National Constitution, these institutions independent of the state who are continuing a commitment to educators, to knowledge, particularly to K through 12 classrooms.
Yes.
And I'm honored to contribute to the work that is happening through those kinds of institutions. I think we have to use new media. Well, here we are on a podcast. We exemplify part of what needs to be happening. But those of us who have been reluctant or shy, let's work together to learn how to take advantage of these opportunities, because this is where students and teachers, learners of all ages are coming to hear the things they need to hear, to encounter the ideas they need to encounter, to push back against what is not happening in classrooms, what is not happening in public libraries. So this technology is powerful, and
Yes.
And we must continue here. Vanguard is a very special book for me because it chronicled in a very pointed moment around voting rights how African American women had long struggled for the vote. And one of the gifts of working on that book and sharing it with others were the ways in which the past, I think, does teach important lessons about who we can and might aspire to be in the present. And the first, I think, is something akin to about the nature of democracy, and American democracy in particular, which is the ways in which it turns out some of the essential questions, like voting rights, like citizenship, like education, the core building blocks of democracy, have always been, and it turns out they continue to be, up for grabs, up for debate. And we can lament that. But part of what I want to say is take a deep breath. Some of the women I write about, the ones who lived long lives would have told you that the questions that they had struggled with, early in their lives came back in a new form, decades later, if not for them, for others. And so here we are at at another juncture, but not the first juncture, right? In which,
correct.
In particular, Black history is challenged, suppressed, denigrated, and more.
Yes.
Yes. I write about the beginning of the 20th century. So a century ago, Carter G. Woodson founds the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History. Why? Well, Carter Woodson is a brilliant historian and an entrepreneur par excellence. But what he knows is that Black history and Black historians are boxed out of major universities, major centers of research, the major journals, etc. And he builds an association for Black history. And
That's right.
Here we need to be, as we can, small scale, big scale, entrepreneurs, builders of infrastructure that will promote and nourish and hold and share our ideas. I don't know. So I don't know. But so for me, this is about, in some ways, I think, there's an often invoked phrase from President Obama, which is that striving toward a more perfect union. I agree with the president on the striving part, but I don't think we may see ourselves ever as a perfect union. It's the striving that is really characteristic of this country. And we are in a moment where we are, mightily striving for values that even democracy doesn't guarantee to us. We have to breathe those values. And that with the women of Vanguard, they breathe their sense of an entitlement to citizenship and voting rights. They breathe that into the nation. They don't receive that. Nobody gives that to them. And we are in another moment, right, where we are breathing that quite literally into the life of this nation. And it is formidable. It is formidable, as I know we're all experiencing.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Martha, thank you so much. This was such an enriching and wonderful conversation with you. Congratulations again on all of your successes, both with your published work and also with Hard Histories at Hopkins. Thank you so much. What an amazing dialogue today.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to our interview with Dr. Martha S. Jones. Sign up to receive our newsletter, follow us on social media, and subscribe to our podcasts that are available on most podcasting platforms. Be well. Yes.